Welcome to everyone today. This our online audience. It's a great pleasure to introduce Andrea Brock. I'm not going to do a long introduction because I think probably Andrea doesn't need it for most of you. But Andrea works on the environmental history of the ancient Mediterranean broadly, particularly on water history, environmental archaeology, and particularly on the city of Rome, which we're going to hear about today. She has a rapidly expanding stream of publications, maybe not quite a flood yet, but I'm sure it's going to turn into a flood in the coming years on those topics. And just to take one example, if you just want one starting point, Andrea's work, amazing Journal of Rome Studies article from 2021 on the banks of a time of opportunity and transformation in Rome's fantastic place to start. Andrea's working now on an expansion of that project into something even more ambitious, working on a book project funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh Network Research Grant Scheme. And that, I think, is what we're going to hear about today. Andrew is going to speak to us today about Rome as it's for a new history of early Rome and its republic. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks to all of you for taking time on a very dark Friday afternoon to spend it here with me. I know a lot of you have heard from me in the past, so I thank you for being willing to listen through another rendition of this. So there will be some familiar content probably, especially for those students of mine in the room and online, but I'm really hoping to craft this research for a broad audience, and so I'm trying to tell it in a slightly different way, and so I really welcome your feedback. Two profoundly influential pieces of scholarship on the Mediterranean engaged with the fundamental question of how the environment shaped the trajectory of societies in the region. Fernand Brauddel's history of the Mediterranean in the 16th century was actually a much deeper story, where millennia of human experience were shaped by the sea's currents, flowing rivers, and the many products of the land. For Braudel, the contours of Mediterranean geography and climate were sufficiently stable over long periods of time, which he referred to as the longue durée, such that scholars could rely on basic laws of ecological consistency to better understand human behavior, as well as the development of economic and social systems. A half century later, Horden and Purcell offered another pivotal answer to this question. For them, the longue durée history of the Mediterranean played out in many diverse microregions, each of which, along with local cultures, were subjected to a variety of unpredictable ecological uncertainties. Their account of societies in the ancient Mediterranean is therefore punctuated with sporadic periods of glut and dearth. Horden and Purcell recognized that this complex interwoven global system in the ancient Med helps societies react to complex environmental risks. Through contact, trade, and the movement of goods and people and ideas, the societies around the Mediterranean were deeply connected to each other and therefore never completely isolated to the particular whims of their micro-regional circumstance. Instead, they were each integrated, more or less, into a much larger social, economic, and ecological tapestry that had existed in the Mediterranean basin at least since the Bronze Age. It's been a quarter century since the corrupting sea, and tremendous progress has been made possible with the expansion and refinement of absolute dating techniques on a wide range of archaeological and organic materials. When Braudel put out his 2-volume thesis, radiocarbon dating was in its infancy. Progress on archaeological and scientific chronologies has accelerated exponentially in recent decades. And as a result, so too has our visibility on past Mediterranean environments. Alongside these improvements in absolute dating techniques, there have also been a surge of new environmental data sets, thanks in part to the tedious efforts of many geoarchaeologists, paleobotanical specialists, geochemists, and climate scientists. The details of ancient Mediterranean environments are coming into focus like never before. Looking across this growing corpus of paleo-environmental evidence, it's now possible to see how both Bordell, and Horton and Purcell captured important truths of the ecological story. On the one hand, the Mediterranean climate and landscape seem to have been generally stable, so that any given microregion would have experienced regular seasonal variations, but otherwise conditions were such that there could have been ecological consistency and limited environmental change for long stretches of time. Or, as John Bentliff put it in a recent State of the Field article, quote, "Stability is the dominant mode for Mediterranean landscapes," end quote. On the other hand, it is clear that these periods of relative stability within each microregion were nonetheless punctuated with major episodes of environmental change or ecological risk. Indeed, ample evidence exists for various types and scales of environmental change happening all over the Mediterranean. Expanding data sets on past climate and landscape change at local and regional scales can be combined with rich archaeological and historical evidence to open new cross-disciplinary research pathways. For this reason, there has never been a more fruitful time to critically examine the complex effects of environmental change on past human societies, and in turn, apply this knowledge to help us respond to our own modern predicament. As one busy bee in this increasingly robust scholarly discourse, I offer today a close look at one case study on past human-environment interactions, that of prehistoric Rome. This research project began 13 years ago and involved drilling 22 cores from the street level along Rome's riverbank. Coring survey offered us a very narrow but very deep look at Rome's central river valley. Narrow, in that my study area is just the size of a few square city blocks. Deep, in that we had to drill down 15 meters below the street level in order to sample the entire depth of the archaeological stratigraphy. This is the central area of the project, the Forum Boarium, as it looks today, at the foot of the Capitoline and Palatine Hills and adjacent to the Tiber Island. It is apparent that prior to intensive urbanization, this area looked much different. Here we had the meeting of three rivers, the Tiber, and two small tributary streams, one from a valley called the Velabrum and another from the valley of what would become the Circus Maximus. At the point of confluence, where these fluvial systems met just north of the Aventine Hill, the ground level was heavily eroded, so that this part of the landscape was especially low. The image that you're seeing here is actually a topographic map of modern Rome, so not the period that I'm referring to, but I like to show it because the kind of rich green color that you see here is this kind of impression of what is still kind of the lowest area in Rome's local landscape. So the cores have allowed us to identify this low base level of the valley, largely thanks to the inclusion of ceramic fragments littered across the riverbed and floodplain, including grains of pottery not much bigger than sand, which mark the arrival of humans in the region. This is the deepest archaeological material from Rome, situated in what was once the lowest point on the local landscape at the time when humans first settled in the area. Although the collaborative geoarchaeological project remains ongoing, with publications forthcoming and additional cores planned, the available evidence already reveals that the relatively low, stable river valley rapidly transformed early in the city's development. Today, I aim to reflect on these recent discoveries and engage with some of the bigger picture implications. How did the environment at Rome change as the community grew in prehistory? How was that change perceived by contemporary inhabitants? How did the prehistoric community at Rome respond? I begin today by examining the prehistoric landscape at Rome before I turn to the changes of the 6th century BCE. Then, in the final part of my talk today, I'll consider the range of responses that the ancient Romans brought to bear on the large-scale environmental and economic challenges that they faced from the late 6th century. As this is a work in progress, I very much value your feedback, whether during the Q&A today or via email. Among other goals for this project, I hope to craft a version of this narrative of Rome's origins for education and outreach purposes. So I welcome input on how to effectively package my research to make it accessible to a broad audience. It is my hope that telling this new history of early Rome will not simply help us understand the beginnings of a single city or even the ancient Romans themselves, but that this one case study can serve a larger goal of investigating how past societies were impacted by and responded to environmental changes. So let's begin. If you pick up most any history of Rome, you're likely to find some reference to the city's 7 hills, originally separated by marshy valleys, even though there were actually more than 7 hills and no marsh. So I'm actually just giving you 2 kind of visual representations of this rather entrenched notion. So here's an etching from Lanciani in the late 19th century, where you see this kind of watery formation in the area of what would become the Forum Valarum. And here's a really commonly reproduced image of the Capitoline Hill in the early Iron Age. So here you see the mud brick huts and such on top of the hill, and then this very swampy lowland in the foreground. Again, this is a very entrenched notion that we have for early Rome. And in this vision of Rome's prehistory, the watery valleys separate the hilltop settlements by creating a physical barrier that prohibits movement, hinders communication, and stifles cohesion. Human intervention in the form of land reclamation and drainage in this version of the story become necessary prerequisites for urbanization. New discoveries, thanks to deep coring survey, allow us to revise these entrenched notions. Although coring in the area has indeed revealed some remnants of a permanently wet, swampy landscape, these deposits have been radiocarbon dated to the 6th millennium BCE. This was thousands of years before the beginnings of sedentary habitation in the vicinity of Rome. By the time people began to settle on these hills in the Bronze Age, we have no indication of a widespread permanent wet marsh in this part of Rome. Rather, this area was characterized by a floodplain zone, which would be seasonally inundated by overbank floods of the Tiber. After a flood event, the lowland would naturally drain and gradually dry out. Coring along Rome's riverbank has also shown that the Tiber River originally flowed closer to the hills of Rome. Deposits associated with the ancient riverbed are found at elevations around 1 meter below the modern sea level, stretching roughly 100 meters east of the river's current bank. So in this reconstruction here, the dashed line in blue is the position of the modern Tiber bank. And so you can see how coring to the side of this, we've seen remnants of the riverbed, as you see depicted here, much further east. Adjacent to the ancient riverbed, the contemporary shore was about 2 meters higher, around 1 meter above sea level. This evidence suggests that the prehistoric landscape was characterized by a wider river channel and an adjacent floodplain. I argue that people and livestock in the prehistoric period could take advantage of this low shore and wide point in the river channel where waters could spread and dissipate, allowing easy access to the river and even a crossing point between the regions of Etruria to the north and Latium to the south. In addition to offering a ford of the river, the area would have also been well suited as a natural harbor. Prehistoric boats were typically small and shallow bottomed, and thus could be easily hauled ashore and beached in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, even without relying on any built port infrastructure. So we see the beginnings of permanent settlement on the hills overlooking this floodplain from the mid-2nd millennium BCE. In particular, there have been extensive excavations on the Capitoline Hill here, which show evidence of this settlement activity from the Middle Bronze Age. So this fits with broader trends in the region of Turanian Central Italy, where hilltops were exploited for early habitation, as elevated positions offered natural defenses in a cultural context where raiding warfare was common. In contrast to the hilltops, I argue that Rome's central lowland was originally not conducive to permanent occupation or appealing for early building installations. In addition to vulnerabilities to raiding parties, the prehistoric inhabitants of Rome were undoubtedly accustomed to the Tiber's seasonal fluctuations, which included a risk of overbank flood events, especially during the rainy winter season. Given that the main building materials of the time were mud brick or wattle and daub, which would not hold up well to immersion in water, we should assume that areas perceived to be even slightly at risk of flood were not appealing for the growth of domestic space or other architectural investments. Indeed, excavations in the valley between the Capitoline and Palatine Hills have shown that the prehistoric inhabitants on the hilltops originally used this area as a place to bury their dead. And I'm showing you an aerial photo from Giacomo Boni's excavations in the former Monum at the turn of the 20th century, when this necropolis was first uncovered. Crucially, this practice ceased by the end of the 9th century, when funerary activity shifted away to the Esquiline Hill. From the 8th century, Rome's central river valley seems to have been an open space, no longer serving as a necropolis, but with floodplains predictably at risk of inundation and therefore unsuitable for domestic structures. So while the Tiber undoubtedly flooded in this prehistoric era, such events would have caused little, if any, destruction, in part because inhabitants were undoubtedly familiar with this seasonal behavior and would have avoided building in areas perceived to be at risk of flood. Furthermore, I argue that floods would not have hampered river-related activities in the floodplain during the dry months of the year. Here I'm showing you how historical records of Tiber floods suggest that they are most likely to occur between the months of November and February, whereas other months of the year have little, if any, risk of flood. While this is not directly reflective of floods in the prehistoric context, it's a good indication of the Tiber's seasonal behavior. Although every winter brought the potential for inundation, the opposite was also true. The area was reliably dry and open in other months of the year when river levels were at their normal low flow. Although I should stress that prehistoric human activities in the river valley left few material traces, the available evidence is indicative of a space that would have been well suited to support a range of seasonal ventures. In the original 10-month calendar used in early Rome, the year started with the month of March, named after Mars, the god of war. It's thought that early military campaigns traditionally set out in the spring and likely returned with loot before the summer harvest. I have already noted the potential for livestock to cross at this point when the river was at a low level, a shepherding process that would have been necessary prior to sheep shearing in the late spring and moving herds to fresh pastures. The most important agricultural products, cereals, were harvested in July, with the grain collected and put into storage in August. Additionally, salt production would have taken place predominantly in the summer months, as the process relied on sunny, dry days to facilitate solar evaporation. Once collected from salt pans near the coast, this valuable resource, crucial for both human and livestock diets, was transported along the Via Salaria, the ancient salt road, through Rome and further inland. Clay extraction and processing also occurred predominantly in the summer months, during the driest months of the year. The majority of clay deposits are exposed along the eroded sides of a river valley, areas that would be much easier to access and mine during the months when water levels were lowest. Moreover, tiles and other clay materials would need to be laid out to dry before being fired in the kiln. So such work would have required an open area and some assurance that rain or floods would not ruin the work. Indeed, some of the earliest clay tiles from Rome have been sourced to clay beds from this area, the Valley of the Velabrum. So we know that they were using this place for such industrial activities, at least from the late 7th century. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Mediterranean seafaring relied on seasonal winds, so that the vast majority of sailing concluded before the end of October. Beginning in the 8th century, vast quantities of Greek goods arrived in Italy via Mediterranean shipping networks. As sailors would not find many suitable harbors along the coast of Turanian central Italy, they could instead have sailed into the mouth of the Tiber, the largest river in the region, and traveled upstream using some combination of oar, towing, or push-pull. So while this list of activities is far from exhaustive and to a certain extent only speculative, the timeline of fairs and festivals, as preserved in the early Roman calendar, offers further support for a peak of prehistoric activity in the spring, summer, and autumn. During the months when Rome's central river valley was likely to be the busiest, in the era between the 8th and the early 6th centuries BCE, there would have been little, if any, threat of disruption due to floods. In contrast, during the months of the year when the river was in flood, I expect there were far fewer people around to be inconvenienced by it, in part because the permanent population living on the hills of Rome was probably still relatively small. At this point, with new environmental data in hand, it is time to set aside old notions that Rome's prehistoric valleys were marshy or so flood-prone in prehistory that it hindered the growth of a settlement or required massive efforts at landscape modification. Instead, the landscape that is beginning to come into focus was actually one of tremendous opportunity, especially from the 8th century BCE, when we can see that the area was no longer being used for burials. This section of River Valley offered natural routes of access to the river and an otherwise open and unencumbered floodplain that provided space to facilitate a range of seasonal activities and a temporary surge of people in the area. Such operations would require reliable, open access to the river valley, not simply for local inhabitants, but also for foreigners and neighbors moving to and through Rome. In such a place that is defined by its accessibility, vulnerabilities to raiding warfare would have encouraged collective action for defensive purposes. I suggest that early cooperation or agreement, particularly with regard to shared space and defense, would have been necessary to control and toll the movement of people, livestock, natural resources, and foreign goods. But beyond that basic cooperation and control of movement through the area, I want to stress that prehistoric operations in the river valley would have required minimal infrastructural investment or landscape management. Given the predictable patterns of seasonal flooding and a well-drained landscape, we can expect that the prehistoric community at Rome was well placed to capitalize on their opportune river valley, even without the need to first invest in drainage systems, land reclamation, port infrastructure, or other large-scale interventions. In this sense, Rome from the 8th century BCE is one where we see the beginnings of collective action to occupy and exploit this opportune position on the Tiber River. Although it is difficult to know for sure how exactly these early inhabitants conceived of this space, except to say that it shouldn't continue to be the graveyard for a single clan's dead ancestors. By the early 6th century, there could be no doubt that this was a highly valued place. Archaeological investigations along the riverbank have uncovered the remnants of a very early and ornately decorated temple building. So I'm showing you here the archaic temple excavated at the Santa Mabona Sanctuary in Rome. I was really fortunate to be part of the team that re-excavated this temple about 13 years ago now. And so this is actually, I've taken this photo and my colleague there is standing on the stone podium of this temple, and its superstructure would have been mud brick, and it also would have had this really ornate terracotta decor. So this is the statue of Hercules and Minerva, currently on display at the Capitoline Museum. So dated around 560 BCE, this is the oldest temple in Rome that we know of archaeologically, and one of the first permanent temples ever built in Italy. It was erected 2 generations before the construction of the city's most important religious structure on the hilltop above, the giant Capitoline Temple. So that's why in this kind of visualization of the area, when this temple was built in 560, you see no Capitoline Temple on the hill above, right? Just the kind of mud brick cuts still. And it was erected here, overlooking the Tiber, at an elevated position, above 7 meters above sea level, along the shoulder of the valley, a place safe from contemporary flood waters, especially as it sat on top of its stone podium. So this was an image I was trying to get working at the beginning, but basically just to show you that floods in this period would have happened, but we would not expect them to reach the level that would jeopardize the temple. So although previous conceptions of early Rome have suggested that the Tiber regularly reached elevations as high as 9 to 12 meters above sea level, as it did in the historical period, such floods would have destroyed this mud brick temple on the riverbank. In actuality, the geoarchaeological evidence indicates that floods in this early period seem to have rarely, if ever, reached elevations over 7 meters above sea level. When the Tiber did swell during the rainy season, it would have overflowed first and most frequently at this low section of the channel banks. Any inundation cresting over 6 meters above sea level would spread into the Velabrum and Circus Maximus valleys. These secondary basins provided substantial accommodation space, allowing water to spread a great deal laterally before continuing to rise vertically. For this reason, the shoulders of the valley, above 7 meters above sea level, offered a secure space for some of the earliest architectural investments in the lowland. In addition to this mud brick temple on its stone podium on the riverbank, early deposits at the Regia and the Comitium in the Forum Romanum are similarly situated on the shoulders of the valley above 7 meters above sea level. We should appreciate that the prehistoric inhabitants of Rome were familiar with the Tiber's flooding behavior, and they would not have invested such cultural and economic resources in mud brick structures that would be readily washed away. It is in this environmental setting, between the 8th and the early 6th centuries BCE, that I think we should be imagining the beginnings of Rome's res publica. Of course, we are securely in prehistory, lacking any contemporary written records, so it is impossible to know when or why this term res publica was first uttered. It is admittedly difficult to translate from the Latin, but in this early period, we might think of it at its most basic, a public thing, the shared property, our common interest. I do not intend to suggest that some form of representative government emerged in these centuries, but that a concept of shared space, both literal and figuratively, religiously, and economically, took hold. I suggest that we should see the res publica developing in this shared section of the river valley, territory that could not be controlled by a single clan, but needed to be accessible to a range of individuals, shepherds, merchants, craftspeople, locals, neighbors, foreigners. In a word, public. For those living on the hills of Rome, controlling this natural crossroads would have represented an obvious opportunity to toll the movement through the river valley. Early agreements around the shared use of such space would have allowed inhabitants to maintain control and exploit the economic opportunities offered by the river valley, thus giving birth to a res publica. To this point, I have described Rome's central river valley as a naturally opportune place that experienced seasonal variability, but was otherwise a relatively stable setting that would have allowed prehistoric inhabitants to capitalize on a range of economic ventures. The fact remains, however, that river valleys are one of the most dynamic types of landscapes that exist on our planet. Indeed, the coring data makes it clear that the Tiber River became highly unstable over the course of the 6th century, as the river valley silted up and flood levels rose to increasing heights. This newly documented landscape change, which I'll return to in a moment, coincides with massive changes on the local and regional landscape, in particular, a boom of settlement activity and urbanization. As revealed in a multitude of excavations across the city since the early 20th century, Rome was embellished with more than a dozen new monumental building projects, now securely dated to the Archaic period, roughly speaking, the late 7th to the early 5th century. In stark contrast to the scarcity of solid-built, permanent constructions in the city prior to this period, the 6th century represents a watershed moment of urbanization as Rome transitioned from hut settlement to urban center. Looking beyond Rome, archaeological field surveys across the Middle Tiber River Valley, one of the most intensely surveyed areas in the world, have also provided rich insight on regional settlement patterns. The British School at Rome recently completed an extensive reassessment of data collected during various surveys conducted since the mid-20th century. The Tiber Valley Project used refined ceramic chronologies that offer finer resolution to site identifications. And importantly, for our understanding of regional activity contemporary with the documented sedimentation, the results demonstrate that, quote, on both sides of the Tiber in the 6th century BCE, there was a true settlement explosion in the territory, more than double that of previous periods. Importantly, this phase of settlement expansion at Rome and across the region made use of a new technology, terracotta roof systems. As they began building on a new monumental scale, the Romans and their Latin and Etruscan neighbors began adorning many of their religious, civic, and domestic structures with terracotta tiles and sculptural decor. First appearing in central Italy in the second half of the 7th century BCE, terracotta roof systems become widespread and mass-produced in subsequent generations. As I argue in an article forthcoming in the Journal of Roman Studies, settlement growth and the proliferation of new tiled roof structures resulted in an unprecedented exploitation of timber resources in the Tiber River Valley during the Archaic period. In addition to timber frames and supports and standing architecture, vast quantities of trees were felled to power the ceramic kilns engaged in the production of roof tiles and terracotta decor. Ceramic kilns were fueled by raw wood and therefore relied on direct access to timber sources. Charcoal is lighter and easier to transport over long distances, but raw wood is extremely heavy, which dramatically increases the costs associated with transport. For this reason, river valleys are a common source and means of transporting timber, as the logs can be cut and easily floated downstream. Deforestation operations are, of course, closely linked to increased erosion and sedimentation in river valleys, as the loss of root systems causes sediment to be released, washed down slope into the river, and eventually deposited in the lower stretches of the alluvial plain. So returning to Rome's central river valley, the cores have revealed a large package of alluvial sediment, well dated to the 6th century. Sometime during the century, the edge of the river channel began to shift westwards, and the floodplain began to fill with sediments. When rivers flood over their banks, their water velocity slows, and they drop fine sediments called silts. In the ancient period, the Tiber River was known as flavus, meaning yellow or golden colored. This reflected the yellowish tint of the sediment suspended in the water. And the Tiber dropped this yellowish silt anywhere it flooded. And so I'm just giving you kind of a close-up view of one section of the core here, where you see these really nice yellowish, silty levels, flood levels here. So the area silted up extremely rapidly over the course of the 6th century BC. More than 5 meters, that's more than 15 feet, of sediment was deposited in the area of the Forum Boarium and in the area of the Tiber Island before the early 5th century. So I'm showing you another core. So this is, one core, but the sections are stacked together. And this one is perhaps our most important core because it really shows the chronology. So this section here labeled A is this horizon that we see across the Forum Boarium with all of these very early sherds kind of littered across the valley floor. The section marked B is this sedimentation that I'm describing associated with the 6th century. And the reason we can really, we got a really narrow chronology here is because C and D are building stones from an early 5th century structure. So really well dated. So again, we've got really strong kind of chronological constraints here that show massive change happening in the 6th century. And I'll come back, we'll see this, this structure in just a little bit. So this sedimentation in Rome's central river valley had major implications for the topography and hydrology of the area from the late 6th century BC onwards. The once gently sloping low-lying shore in the Forum Boarium was filled in, becoming a steep, high riverbank. Additionally, the Tiber Island emerged from the river channel as a product of this intensive sedimentation from the late 6th century. The wider river channel that had once allowed waters to spread and dissipate in earlier generations was transformed into a narrower channel with a deeper and faster flow. Conditions that once supported fording and harbor activities would have been lost, and operations in the river valley would not have been able to continue as they once had. The coring data makes it clear that although significant sedimentation occurred along the riverbank and in the area of the Tiber Island in the latter half of the 6th century, the river continued to deposit silts at least through the 3rd century BCE, until these districts were paved and land inflation stabilized. As the area filled with sediment, drainage from the tributary valleys would have been blocked, creating novel hydrological complications further up valley. Overbank floodwaters would have been constrained and pushed to progressively higher elevations, jeopardizing areas that were previously well drained and safe from inundation. In other words, this environmental change presented both immediate acute pressures as well as a variety of long-lasting consequences. Once predictable flood levels, which shaped the possibilities for early occupation in the lowland, would have been surpassed, as the Tiber established a new normal in its range of behaviors. Whereas floods up to the early 6th century rarely, if ever, topped 7 meters above sea level, mid-Republican flood deposits are found as high as 11 meters above sea level. By the Augustan period, our historical sources record areas of the city at elevations as high as 20 meters above sea level being impacted by floodwaters. As the city of Rome grew, its increasingly urbanized lowland would chronically be at risk of inundation during the rainy season. Of course, there is abundant evidence of flooding in historical and modern Rome, but with my remaining time today, I want to focus on the more or less immediate responses of the inhabitants who first encountered this landscape transformation and had to contend with novel ecological pressures. So the onset of this environmental change, the abrupt, the novel sedimentation, escalating flood levels, and worsening conditions for drainage, represents an acute shock to the community at Rome in the late 6th century. The scale and speed of the sedimentation would have been perceptible to local inhabitants even within a single generation. And there would have been significant repercussions for the previously lucrative activities in the river valley. Taken together, I see this environmental change and economic challenge as spurring a range of responses from the late 6th century, including increasing levels of collective action and elite investment in infrastructure to maintain operations in public space. Fortunately, the archaeological record from archaic Rome is robust, and it testifies to both the scale and speed of the adaptive response of the local inhabitants. As we've seen, the archaic riverbank temple was built in 560 BCE on what was once an elevated shoulder of the valley at a relatively secure elevation several meters above the river. By the end of the 6th century, the river valley had filled with sediments nearly to the elevation of the temple building. In response, the Romans abandoned this early temple and undertook a massive renovation of the site, which involved the construction of a 5-meter tall platform in the early 5th century, supporting 2 new twin temples at an elevation safe from contemporary flood levels. And this image is just another photograph during excavation at the Santa Mobono Sanctuary. So this was after those kind of metal shoring walls that you saw in the first photo, after they had been lifted. And you could see, the scale of this massive Capilaccio Tufo platform. And this is the platform, this is the construction that we see in that core that gives us that really important terminus antiquum. In addition to this overhaul of the riverbank sanctuary, the archaeological record demonstrates that a variety of investments were made in the river valley from the 6th century onwards. These responses include both physical adaptations and major innovations in engineering aimed at mitigating the effects of sedimentation and flooding and maintaining operations in the river valley. I have just noted the use of raised platforms, lifting structures away from floodwaters. We also see the use of water-resistant building materials, the construction of bridges to facilitate river crossings after the loss of the natural river ford, and the construction of embankment walls to stabilize the riverbank. No longer could boats just be hauled ashore. Instead, they would have required built infrastructure in the form of mooring structures along the riverbank. But any port works, as well as bridges across the Tiber, would have been extremely susceptible to destruction during flood events. The Romans probably grew to anticipate such losses and had little choice but to repeatedly rebuild their river infrastructure. Dredging activities began at least by the early 5th century. This would have also been necessary on a periodic basis to improve drainage and keep the channel clear for boats to maneuver. There's also the installation of major drainage infrastructure called the Cloaca Maxima and a reclamation project to raise the ground level in the area that would become the Forum Romana. I interpret each of these investments as mitigation efforts necessary to contend with novel sedimentation and escalating floods from the latter half of the 6th century. All projects that arguably would not have been necessary in the relatively stable ebb and flow of the river valley prior. These large-scale investments and lowland occupation should be understood as reflecting the inhabitants' desire to maintain pre-existing socioeconomic opportunities, particularly those associated with the movement of people, goods, and natural resources through the valley. I want to stress that this was not an inevitable or predictable outcome. As the river valley started to change, the prehistoric inhabitants of Rome could have made decisions that led them to shift their focus away from the river and or urbanize in other areas on the local landscape. But rather than give up on their activities in the river valley, we can see that the inhabitants of Rome adapted, invested, and sought to mitigate the effects of floods. They embarked on a series of unprecedented building projects aimed at managing their dynamic landscape and maintaining operations on and beside the river. We must appreciate that these physical responses visible in the archaeological record would have placed a variety of demands on the community, requiring substantial initial investment as well as recurring expenditures, a larger and enduring local labor force necessary to handle construction, reclamation, maintenance, and cleanup, and repeated repair or rebuilding after flood events. I suggest that this environmental change and the adaptive responses of inhabitants was far beyond the capacity of any one or two clans, or even any one or two generations. This necessitated an evolution in state-level structures capable of providing both prompt and enduring management of the landscape. I argue that one feature that helped inhabitants respond to this challenge was the res publica, their history of shared interest in the river and the use of public space in the river's floodplain. To meet the moment, however, their res publica would need to be adapted and expanded. Although it's difficult to fully understand the complex circumstances that led to the establishment of Rome's republican system of government, I argue that sudden environmental changes and economic challenges in the late 6th century necessitated an evolution in collective action, particularly with regard to expenditures and labor, as well as state-level administration, such as officials responsible for landscape management projects and early record keeping. The need for new levels of landscape management, which probably began in an ad hoc fashion in the late 6th century, began to be formalized into law by the mid-5th century BCE. One of the earliest pieces of historical documentation we have from Rome, the city's first law code, called the 12 Tables, reflects some degree of state-level oversight of the river valley. According to a law of the 12 Tables, If a water course directed through a public place shall do damage to a private person, there shall be right of suit by the owner to the effect that the damage shall be repaired for him. I note that this is the only reference to a public place, a publicum locum, in the surviving sections of the law code, which is, with few exceptions, primarily interested in private law, particularly those that helped codify the power and wealth of the clan groups and their patres familias. Given that the private individual in Rome had little ability to protect their interests from the consequences of floods, we can interpret this law as the young state beginning to formalize its oversight of water and take responsibility to maintain operations and public spaces. Flooding and sedimentation in these areas would have impacted diverse segments of society, from the elite families hoping to extract wealth via control of the movement of goods, to the lower levels of society, the merchant, the shepherd, and craftsperson, who similarly relied on access to the river as well as a functioning harbor and market for their personal prosperity. Although it is impossible to know how this law was originally applied in practice, it seems to suggest that the state took responsibility to recover losses experienced by the private person due to flood damage. In this way, shared risk and shared investment leads to shared reward, as various individuals, both Roman and non-Roman, elite and non-elite, could continue to participate in the economic prospects afforded by the Tiber River. So with new data in hand, we can now begin to appreciate how the inhabitants of Rome in the late 6th and 5th centuries BCE reacted to changes in their river valley with a multifaceted response that ranged from innovations in engineering and massive investment in public infrastructure to consequential socio-political developments. These were generations of Romans not seeking to avoid or prevent floods altogether, but rather to accept the risks and work to mitigate the consequences. As with so many ecological challenges, this required a communal response. And a crucial tool in this human environment interplay was the state itself, a collective entity that could spread the risk and costs out across the wider community. The archaeological and historical record makes it clear that the early inhabitants of Rome were not deterred by the Tiber's dynamism, but that they changed the nature of their community involvement and investment in order to respond effectively to their dynamic environment and continue to exploit the opportunities afforded by the Tiber River. The changing environment, therefore, is a potent factor that should be understood as spurring a key evolution of Rome's political and social character, its res publica. Although many of these details of Rome's environment and urban growth are particular to this specific context, I'll conclude today simply by noting that comparable processes of human-environment interaction played out in many different ways across the ancient Mediterranean. We are finally well placed to move beyond a high-level grainy impression of Mediterranean geography and zoom in on specific locales to see in high definition how things changed over time, how the environment changed, how society changed, and how these things happened together. It is now up to environmental archaeologists and historians to capitalize on emergent data sets by offering nuanced accounts of societal response to environmental pressure. I am certain that this next generation of research will not only provide new perspectives on the past, but also help us better understand our own place in a changing world. Thank you.